Welcome to Zensylvania. My name is Eric Adriaans, and I'll be your host, tour guide, or master of ceremonies. You decide which. In Zensylvania, I explore motorcycle zen, meditation, tai chi, and a variety of other obsessions which continue to provide me with meaningful, and sometimes unexpected, insights into living the kind of life I want to live, and being the kind of person I want to be. I'm not an expert in any of these things. In fact, it would probably be a mistake for me to claim to be an expert in anything at all. But I can be a devoted enthusiast, and I generally try to maintain a beginner's mind when it comes to life and all of the wonderful things there are to learn while living it. I started Zensylvania largely due to the influence of 3 books: Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Alfred North Whitehead's Process and Reality, and the Zen teachings of Homeless Kodo. So you can count on a whole lot of time spent on those books. But along the way, I include fiction, poetry, philosophy, interviews, and any content that seems to fit the bill. I'm glad that you've decided to visit me here in Zensylvania. Maybe together we'll be able to figure a few things out. I certainly hope we manage to have a good time. Zensylvania. It's a state of mind. Oh, and one more thing. I take an experimental and iterative approach to the podcast. The episode that you hear today may be updated and improved tomorrow, next week, or even next year. With your feedback and participation, I hope Zensylvania will be a unique and engaging podcast environment which grows and evolves over time to be the kind of place that keeps us, you and I, visiting often. Every now and then in Zensylvania, we tend to get a bit meta and referential about things. You'll notice that many of the essays and inquiries are titled as Footnotes to something. Footnotes to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Footnotes to Nixon. Footnotes to Being Water, etc. While all of this footnoting may seem a bit overdone and repetitive, it isn't without long consideration and, I hope, good reason. In philosophical, religious, and broader academic studies, it's fairly common for works to be titled or subtitled as inquiries, studies, or meditations. While these are all valuable terms within their academic traditions, in Zensylvania, we have some reluctance to imply that our non-expert and generalist musings are a part of any kind of expert studies. Neither are essays in Zensylvania necessarily intended to be criticisms, reviews, or any kind of polemics. If you're looking for expert opinions, they aren't to be found here. What you'll find here are footnotes. So what exactly is a footnote, and why are there footnotes, or dare I foreshadow to say, footprints, all over Zensylvania? Merriam-Webster defines a footnote as a note of reference, explanation, or comment, usually placed below the text on a printed page. And there's a secondary definition that says a footnote is something that is relatively subordinate or minor part of an event, work, or field of interest. Here in Zensylvania, inquiries and contemplations about living a life are not considered to be that life itself. Whether we're exploring Zen, Tai Chi, motorcycle, literature, or any other matters of life, these musings are really only footnotes and minor parts to the real thing. Life is the real thing. designating the collection of observations, musings, and insights as footnotes was inspired by two disparate and, at least for me, inextricably linked areas of investigation. More particularly, I'm citing specific comments by two very different thinkers from the early 20th century. These are Alfred North Whitehead and homeless Kodo Sawaki. Alfred North Whitehead was an English mathematician and philosopher who co-authored Principia Mathematica with Bertrand Russell. While Whitehead's name may not be overly familiar today, in 1929, Whitehead published one of the 20th century's most startling, sophisticated, and complex works of original philosophy, titled Process and Reality. In that book, Whitehead wrote that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Wow, what a line. For a philosopher, that was a collection of sharp words indeed, and it was not Whitehead's only insightful comment in the book. It is the only one we're going to look at right now. The second inspiration for placing so much emphasis on footnoting comes from Japanese thinker Kodo Sawaki. Homeless Kodo Sawaki Roshi was one of Zen Buddhism's most highly regarded contemporary-ish teachers. Sawaki has been widely attributed with the comment that all of Buddhism is a footnote to Zazen. Like Whitehead, that wasn't Sawaki's only profound and insightful comment, but it's the only one we're going to look at today. I have no information about whether Whitehead and Sawaki were aware of each other's work or perspectives. What strikes me is the similarity between these two comments. It simply can't be ignored. Separated as they were by only 20 years in age, these two thinkers appear to me as if they were contemporaries. This perception is probably almost wholly incorrect. Whitehead worked as a philosopher and mathematician in England, and Sawaki was a Zen Buddhist priest in Japan. But they both use that metaphor of a footnote to convey something about their work. Their comments were directed to utterly different genres of thought and philosophical traditions. Still, it is entertaining to think that Sawaki and Whitehead might have appreciated each other's outlook, if only they'd been aware of each other's work. Indeed, based upon the modest exposure I've had to their respective writings, I expect they would have found agreement on several other matters as well. The sameness of their comments is an elegant and profound underscoring of the similarities and differences between the Buddhist and perhaps more broadly Eastern philosophy and the European, and again, perhaps more broadly Western philosophy. The emphasis on action and practice in the East, the emphasis on theory and words in the West. Footnotes seems to be the most apt explanation of what Zensylvania articles are all about. They are explanations and explorations. They are references. They're comments. They are subordinate parts to the subjects that they cover. They are documentary footprints to living a life. For all of that, I hope that they have some interest and value for visitors to Zensylvania. And now, on to our essay. I'm no longer completely certain when or how I first became aware of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig. I do know that it was never on the reading list for any high school or university courses that I took during my academic days, in the 1980s and early 1990s. It seems probable that I came across references to it in some of the car and motorcycle magazines that I seemed to be continuously buying during the early decades of my life. It is my certain memory that my first attempt to read the book occurred in that same period. The first copy that I picked up had a pink cover with the wrench as lotus flower logo perched atop the book's title, which itself was printed in a bold black font. I recall that as clearly as I recall that I abandoned the book partway through as a waste of time and energy. I had no use for whatever the guy was on about. It took perhaps another 6 to 10 years to pass before I was even ready to try it a second time. What I want to do now is try to share some of the reasons that I enjoy the book so much, as well as the ways that I think Zen and the Art is a much more sophisticated and accomplished book than it is often given credit for. In my opinion, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is a book of Zen, of philosophy, and of motorcycling. And in this essay, I'm going to start right at the beginning with the title to demonstrate some of my points. Over the course of several readings since March 2014, that's the date of my second attempt to read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, it has become one of my favorite books. It has also been the launching point for several personally meaningful literary and philosophical inquiries. Before we go any further, let's give the book its complete title and deal with the matter of repeating that title. The full title is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an Inquiry into Values. In this essay and in other places, I expect to contract that rather large mouthful to ZAM, Z-A-M-M. That contraction is not my creation, but it is extremely convenient. Upon occasion, I may also say simply Zen and the Art. Now, why do I enjoy this book so much? Well, perhaps its arrival in my attention on that second go-round was ideally timed to my needs and to issues that seem to be playing a big part in my life. Some might argue that I was just looking for the opportunity to indulge in some faux intellectualization and lifestyle posing. I'm not going to quibble over the extent that such an argument might be true. Let the critics have their fun. That's the pose they prefer to strike. Instead, after considerable self-examination, I'm going to suggest that I think I enjoy Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance because of how accomplished the book is in its design and intent, and also how effective and evocative the book's metaphors are. Now, as a piece of literature, Zen and the Art seems capable of being linked to and celebrated with many of the English language literary classics. But I'm already leaping far ahead of where I want to be. It's also pretty fun to explore motorcycles, Zen, and philosophy. Given how frequently the book has been ignored, rejected, and scorned by critics of various types, and given the significant amount of time that has passed since its publication, an admission of affection for the book could be considered something of a sidelining move for anybody interested in academia. After all, does anybody take the book seriously? Almost certainly not in the academic world. I'm aware of only a tiny handful of efforts to address Pirsig's work by serious academics in the decades since it was first published. Most of those have focused on the philosophical content and nature of the book rather than any literary merits it may have. When I say this, I'm obviously referring almost wholly to Dr. Anthony McWatt's academic thesis on the book, and to Ronald DeSanto and Thomas J. Steele's guidebook to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Of course, there was also the online MOQ.org pages, which were devoted to developing Pirsig's metaphysics of quality. Now, Pirsig is just about as completely ignored by serious academic philosophy departments as he is utterly ignored by serious literature departments. But I really have no idea whether serious Zen scholars or practitioners may be similarly disinterested. I simply don't know. And yet, there's never seemed to be a shortage of people who are interested in the book and its ideas. Search the internet, and there seems to be a substantial and frankly growing number of articles, reviews, videos, and indeed podcasts which engage with the book, the author, and the philosophy. That Pirsig's philosophy is largely ignored or dismissed was not only anticipated by Pirsig, he covered it within the book. In fact, academic scorn, and by the way, scorn for academia, are central considerations of Zen and the art. So maybe this is all entirely appropriate to my state of affairs in deciding to devote so much time to it. So, what is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? There are plenty of resources that provide a brief plot summary or philosophical synopsis of the book. These resources will advise that Zen is a semi-fictional narrative about a cross-country father-son motorcycle vacation, that it is a critique of the human condition contemporary to the second half of the 20th century. Some will suggest that it is a cultural exploration and a work of philosophy. Not many of these sources will suggest that it is actually a book of Zen, nor that it is an attempt by a serious intellectual to develop an original metaphysical philosophy. Fewer still will mention that Zen is a critique of both Eastern and European philosophy and academia. Almost nobody talks about Zen as a critique of religion, particularly Messianic religion. I haven't seen anyone call Zen an epic monster story or supernatural thriller. Frankly, it's rarely, if ever, declared a tightly connected literary work, and I would contend that it is all of these things. Many first-time readers find the book frustrating, challenging, annoying, offensive, dated, or boring, and the narrator to be frequently unappealing. Perspectives of this type are likely to increase as time passes and as we get further from the times in which Pirsig lived. While many first-time readers, myself included, are alienated by the book, many others have found it uniquely compelling. Millions of copies of the book have been sold since it was first published in 1974. Brand new copies may still be purchased at most bookstores on any day you may visit. That's more than 45 years later. Pirsig and others will claim that there isn't another book of philosophy that has been published in larger numbers. I'm not convinced that that claim entirely holds up. It seems to be a kind of superlative that suits marketing purposes, but then again, I haven't yet seen anybody demonstrate the claim to be false. Another thing that causes first-time readers concern, particularly readers in the 21st century, is the relative unlikability of the book's central character. Zen's central character seems to be Robert Pirsig. The book seems to be a personal memoir of a particular motorcycle journey that Pirsig took with his son, Chris. Simultaneously, It appears to be a memoir of Pirsig's intellectual development over the first couple of decades of his adult life. But those appearances may only be partially or incompletely true. There's every reason to believe it's a bad idea to oversimplify what the book is. It's probably more accurate to say that Pirsig used Zen in the Art to float a mythologized version of himself at different stages of life as a depiction of some ideas that he wanted to showcase. I think of the book this way. Robert Pirsig was the actual author who cast an unnamed narrator to tell the story of a mythologized earlier self. That mythologized earlier self is named Phaedrus, a name which Pirsig borrowed from the writings of Plato. It should not go unnoticed or unmentioned that the story's narrator is never directly named in the text. It is the narrator who takes pains to identify the earlier self as Phaedrus. It seems entirely likely that Pirsig was demonstrating some very Zen-consistent notions about concepts of self, while also signaling that the narrator is not quite Robert Pirsig. The narrator that conveys the story via a series of what he calls Chautauqua meditations. In contemporary internet-based culture, you can find any number of people that post video blogs or vlogs of their own Chautauquas as they ride their motorcycles. Well, the narrator remains unnamed throughout the story and may be considered to be significantly closer to non-existence as a result. It's an interesting entree to Pirsig's approach to consider what Pirsig may have been attempting to convey in this method of presenting and portraying identity. And that brings us back to the relative unlikability of the central character. It seems extremely unlikely that Pirsig, the real author, was unaware of how off-putting the character is. In fact, I'm going to suggest that he knew very well how unappealing the narrator is. But let's pack that away for another day's deeper consideration. What I want to suggest that there's more to it than a lack of self-awareness on Robert Pirsig's part. Let me also suggest that when a reader gets stuck on whether they like a book's narrator, or for that matter, the earlier Phaedrus persona, this may result in a failure to proceed to a demonstrated point about the nature of persona. Perhaps also a demonstrated point about whether likability is a valid prerequisite to insight or wisdom. Despite anything naysayers may argue about Zam, it is an extraordinarily subtle and integrated creation from cover to cover. I argue that it is too subtle to fully catch everything the book has to offer the first and possibly even the fifth time through. At least that has been my experience. So let us begin before the beginning of the story with the title and the author's note. It seems to me that before the Chautauquas have even begun, this small collection of words provides a kind of lens or filter for approaching the book. Again, the full title is Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, an Inquiry into Values. Immediately, the juxtaposition of two different and disconnected themes is set out. These are, of course, Zen on the one side and motorcycle maintenance, or the art of motorcycle maintenance, on the other. But it's important to note that Pirsig did not put the two terms in opposition to each other. He joined them by using the word and. It is Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, not, for example, Zen versus the art of motorcycle maintenance. It needs to be clear that Pirsig's use of the word and is not solely a bit of connective grammar. It bears a purpose. Certainly the word and is a necessary linguistic feature. It is a conjunction which helps us to understand that Zen is somehow distinct from the art of motorcycle maintenance, but that doesn't mean it's apart. The word and is also a logical term. An and gate is a basic digital logic feature which allows that a specific output is only provided when multiple specific inputs are available. In other words, Pirsig's title allows placement of Zen as one specific input and the art of motorcycle maintenance as another at the front end of a logic gate. The two are brought together for an output. In effect, they are synthesized. By viewing the words Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance in mathematical terms, there is an interesting and elegant demonstration of the kind of inquiry that takes place throughout the book. A central theme of Zen philosophy is a rejection of dualism. It is reasonable in Zen to argue that Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance are not separate and distinct from each other. Viewing the title as an kind of an and gate, as a synthesis point, makes this point explicitly. You just have to be familiar with the language and to be open to reconsidering your perspectives. This type of layered language carries on throughout the book. It's fundamental to Pirsig's philosophical and rhetorical approach. For readers who are not comfortable with juggling a variety of conceptual notions while following a narrative process, this ought to be taken as a warning that things may be more complex than they may initially seem. So let's take a step back from logic gates and get back to those two initial themes. In 1974, when the book was published, Zen was still a very new and relatively mysterious topic in mainstream North America. Consider that Bruce Lee, who did so much to familiarize North Americans with Kung Fu and some other basic Eastern philosophy concepts, had just died in 1973. Similarly, the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, that's a collection of teachings of Shunryu Suzuki, had been published only in 1970. Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind is one of the earliest books published about Zen for the American market, and today it's considered to be something of a classic. In using Zen in the title of his book, Pirsig was essentially an avant-garde writer who was citing trends and information that was, to his initial audience, still foreign and rather mysterious. Even now, some rounded 50 years later, mentioning Zen is marginally less exotic to a great many people on the American continents. In North America, perhaps 1% of the population may be identified as Buddhist, and certainly not all of those are Zen Buddhists. While Zen may now be more familiar to Western culture than it was in the middle of the last century, if you mention Zen to most people, several stereotypical connotations may come up in conversation. Nature and peaceful, relaxed environments such as Zen gardens, perhaps minimalist home design, meditation, and strangely paradoxical puzzle stories. Certainly contemplation. Further conversation may yield the question, is Zen a religion or a practice? Well, yes. And who is the Zen enthusiast? Maybe someone wearing pajamas or a robe, sitting in meditation or telling paradox puzzle stories with gnomish humor. As we've already noted, juxtaposed to The Zen in the title is motorcycle maintenance. And here we have chemicals, wrenches, oil, grease, noisy machines, stinky exhaust. And a motorcyclist? Let's rephrase that to a biker. Well, we have the wild, unpredictable violence. The most likely interaction scenario probably involves fear of physical or verbal assault. These unkempt and barbarian-like bikers will probably be described as wearing some combination of denim and leather. The biker, so the stereotype goes, will guzzle beer at least. While they may not be real any longer, these conceptions do need to be noted. Not long ago, one of North American television's most popular shows exploited exactly these stereotypes. So the commonplace ideas of Zen and the commonplace ideas of motorcycles seem to be opposites to each other. They don't seem to be the kind of thing that one would require as simultaneous inputs to an AND gate synthesizing philosophy. But then again, Pirsig took pains to show off his Honda CB77 Superhawk in publicity photos, even though the specific model of his bike wasn't actually mentioned in the story. It's a nice looking bike. The CB77 was manufactured from 1961 through to 67 with a 305cc parallel twin engine, which produced just under 30 horsepower. Pirsig's was all chrome and black, and he considered it a highway machine. It was, compared to other Japanese bikes of the day, considered rather large. Today, though, the bike would be considered rather small. The choice of a chrome and black Japanese bike doesn't seem like an uncalculated decision by Pirsig. In 1966, Honda had a popular advertising campaign built around the slogan, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda." This wasn't the veterans of World War II who established the biker image with Harley Davidsons and Indians. This was a shiny little Japanese bike, a cute bike, a friendly and engaging bike. To extend the point I'm trying to make in literary terms, Robert Pirsig's generation and ethos should not be confused with Jack Kerouac and the bohemian hedonism of the Beat generation, though they may have, metaphorically speaking, traveled some similar roads. At the time the book was presented, Pirsig was a 40-something-year-old father with a job and a short vacation. He presents himself as a former academic and a middle-aged man with the challenges and preoccupations that these imply. He presents himself as an educated everyman on a holiday. It also doesn't hurt that his bike, like his Zen, comes from Japan. This difference is as essential to placing Pirsig in North American literature as is Pirsig's AND gate juxtapositioning of seemingly separate things. To read Zen, you must be prepared to attempt to reconcile and synthesize concepts which you may have previously considered mutually exclusive. The book is anti-dogmatic in its own way. Already in the title, there is a lesson in its philosophy. The title warns that the reader should be thinking about and through a Zen-like perspective, but also about and through a modern scientific technological perspective. However, even here, in the simple matter of the book's title, Pirsig is still not quite done. Right in the middle of the title, Pirsig used the word art to foreshadow investigation of concepts from European philosophy, particularly Plato and Aristotle. He uses the word art as we might currently use the word craft. Art in the title and in the book is not a throwaway word. It is a functioning and significant philosophical term. It establishes that the book will consider the matter of craftsmanship and aesthetics in a philosophical and practical context. Considering Pirsig's use of the word art brings to mind a number of more recent books which have drawn on the same ideas. Now let's just list a few of the books that come to mind. We have Richard Sennett's The Craftsman, Matthew Crawford's Shop Class as Soulcraft, Alexander Langland's Craft, Aaron James's Surfing with Sartre, an aquatic inquiry into the meaning of life, and most recent of them all, John Cogg's Hiking with Nietzsche on Becoming Who You Are. All of these books draw on similar themes that Robert Pirsig's book established several decades ago. Now, we're not quite done exploring the layers of the book's title. The subtitle is An Inquiry into Values. This subtitle's use of the term inquiry establishes ZAM as a philosophical exploration, while values sets that exploration within a particular area dealing with ethics and aesthetics. So what is ZAM? According to the title, it's a philosophical inquiry into values. This is an important observation of the inclusion of the explanatory subtitle. Pirsig and the publishers did not set the book as a work of narrative fiction, nor as an adventure travel book, nor as a memoir. It was to be taken primarily as a work of philosophy. With all of this happening on the title page, the first thing one finds inside the book is an author's note. Let's read that author's note right now. Author's note. What follows is based on actual occurrences, although much has been changed for rhetorical purposes. It must be regarded in its essence as fact. However, it should in no way be associated with that great body of factual information relating to Zen Buddhist practice. It's not very factual on motorcycles either. As with the title page, every sentence and phrase here requires attention that can help the diligent reader to understand and follow the book. I contend that the author's note is a kind of Zen koan, those paradoxical puzzle stories, for the reader. That this passage is called the author's note hints again at one of the challenging features of the book, which is identity. I've already established that Robert Pirsig, the narrator, and Phaedrus can be perceived as observations of identity quite apart from who they actually are. Over the course of ZAM, the main character of the book is never explicitly named or referenced as Robert Pirsig. In most discussions of the book, there's reference to the narrator and to Phaedrus. Through the course of the book, Phaedrus is revealed as the younger and different version of the narrator. Generally, it's presumed that Robert Pirsig, the author, is both the narrator and Phaedrus. However, with the book's inherent emphasis of separate identities, it cannot be assumed that the characters in the book are genuine depictions of Robert Pirsig and his family and friends. The author's note states that the events of the book are based on actual occurrences. So we can be confident that Robert Pirsig took a motorcycle trip with his son, Chris, and a few friends. Indeed, there are readily available photographs of the trips, as well as external interviews of people upon whom characters in the books are based. Now, interestingly and tellingly, the term actual occurrences in that author's note is strikingly similar to Alfred North Whitehead's term actual entities from a book that is widely regarded as one of the most difficult and dense books of 20th century European philosophy, Process and Reality. Whitehead's philosophy of organism something that resulted in at least one recognized philosophical offshoot called process theology, is deeply embedded in Pirsig's metaphysics of quality. Pirsig mentions Whitehead in Zen and the Art, though the reference is brief and may not at first be noted as a significant clue to Pirsig's philosophy. Pirsig did that many times. In fact, there's a passage in the book where he talks about signposts on the road and how the sign makers don't feel the need to show you the sign more than once. The author's note states that the events have been altered for rhetorical purposes, but are basically true. Pirsig spends considerable time defending rhetoric in Zam. In reading Zam, it isn't unreasonable to consider it a work of rhetorical argument. That this term is included in the author's note is another hint of things to expect in the book. Pirsig then ends by commenting that the book is not to be confused with an explanation of Zen or motorcycles. Pirsig's playing a bit of a game here. Zam does not spend much time in explaining or analyzing these things. That's true. Instead, Zam demonstrates them in action. If meditation is Buddhism in practice, Pirsig presents motorcycling as an alternate practical form of Zen. When discussing Zen and the Art, it's difficult to avoid talking about one part of the book without also talking about the other parts, as I've been trying to do in this essay. But I'm breaking with my attempt here to mention that Pirsig has used the idea of a motorcycle as a metaphor for the self. So when you read just about any passage that talks about motorcycles, you need to be simultaneously thinking about how those concepts relate to the self. So the art of motorcycle maintenance may be literally true about motorcycles, but Pirsig is also exploring how the concepts and realities are also true of the art of self-maintenance. With that bit of information, the title Zen and the Art of Self-Care might seem to be a more direct way to convey the subject matter. But that wouldn't really have been in the spirit of Zen, and it wouldn't really have been as iconic a title. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is very memorable. Zen and the Art of Self-Care is very forgettable. So Pirsig positioned Zam such that it should not be considered as fiction nor as nonfiction. And as occurs frequently in the book, Pirsig demonstrates a rejection of dualism, such as fiction, nonfiction, in preference to synthesis. The book is neither fiction nor is it nonfiction. Like any mythology, it is both. He placed the book as a book of philosophy that depicts rather than explains. It is, in essence, a kind of mythology. At the beginning of this article, I argued that Zen and the Art is a book of philosophy and of Zen and of motorcycling. I use that phrasing to indicate that the book is a product of those traditions, experiences, and perspectives. It's an outcome. It's a rhetorical depiction. It is an effect of those causes. It is, quite simply, the other side of an AND gate. Even if I'm correct about my interpretations of Zen and the Art as a book, none of that gives any good reason to take it seriously some 50 years after its publication. Certainly, there has been much change in society that should displace any relevance that it might have today. But I think that Zam still has something to teach about our current times, even if those teachings are not always wholly correct or wholly reliable. But then, isn't that reasonably true about any philosophy and perspective that you care to mention? Primarily, I think the world needs much more AND gate synthesis-oriented thinking. Pirsig's metaphysics of quality and its connection to Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy of organism have insights that are needed by the world today. And though it may not be very factual about them, the bits about Zen and the bits about motorcycles are fun too. In many ways, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is a much better book, a much more subtle book than many of its academic and non-academic critics, whether literary or philosophic, give it credit for. If you haven't read the book, and if anything in this brief introduction to the title and author's note tweaks your interest, maybe you should give it a try. Maybe you'll find some unexpected insights that help you to live the kind of life that you want to live and be the kind of person that you want to be. Thank you for joining me in this part of Zensylvania. I hope that you've enjoyed your time listening to the podcast as much as I did putting it together. You can find text versions of Zensylvania stories and essays at www.zensylvania.com. That's www.zensylvania.com. I expect to release one new episode each month for the foreseeable future. If you like the content you've heard so far, please subscribe, tell your friends, and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. My email address is zensylvaniapodcast@gmail.com, or you may wish to use the link in the episode description box to leave a voice message, which we might then use in this or a future episode. If you'd like to support the Zensylvania Podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Thank you again for joining me in Zensylvania. It's a state of mind.